Okay.
Hello, everyone. This is Kate Fowler with the South Carolina History Newsletter, and today I am so excited to be interviewing Professor Rhondda Robinson Thomas. A quick note before we begin the interview that we might have a little bit of spotty internet today, but we're going to get through it together, and it's going to be a great interview. I'd like to quickly read Professor Thomas's extremely impressive bio so you can see the breadth and the depth of her work. Professor Robinson Thomas is the Calhoun Lemon Professor of Literature at Clemson University, where she teaches, researches, and writes about early African American literature in the Department of English. She has published Call My Name, Clemson, documenting the Black experience in an American university community, which received honorable mention in the National Council on Public History's 2021 Book Awards, and she co-edited the South Carolina Roots of African American Thought. Thomas is the faculty director of the award-winning Call My Name project, for which she has received a fellowship, grants, and gifts through the Clemson University Foundation. She's writing a new play in collaboration with the Tectonic Theater Project, developing a NEH-funded traveling museum exhibit, and producing an 8-part video series based on research for Call My Name, and co-directing the SC Upstate Black Heritage Trail project. She is a busy lady. I love it. In 2021, Thomas was Clemson University's Researcher of the Year and recipient of the Class of '39 Award, the highest honor given to Clemson faculty for service to the university, community, and/or nation. Currently, she serves as the Coordinator of Research and Community Engagement for Clemson University's Cemetery Historic Preservation Project, Chair of the Advisory Committee for Clemson's Memorial for Black Laborers Project, and as a member on the South Carolina State Board of Review for the National Register of Historic Places. Professor Thomas, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here, Kate.
Thank you again. Yes, so I'd love to start by asking you if you could give us an overview of your Call My Name project. This project is really what it's really inspired me in my research around Clemson University, and I would love for you to kind of explain the project and how it came to be for our listeners.
Sure. So Call My Name started, I like to say, on my very first day of work at Clemson. I'm a South Carolinian, but I did not grow up in the state. A couple of years after I was born, my parents moved to Georgia and then to North Carolina. And so I spent most of my upbringing outside of the state, except to come back. But when a job opportunity at Clemson arose, as I was finishing graduate school, I applied and was hired. And on my very first day of work, I learned that Clemson was built on John C. Calhoun's Fort Hill Plantation. So I thought surely in that plantation house that still sits on our campus, the story of slavery and enslaved persons would be included in the tour. But when my students and I went on a tour that fall, I learned that at that time in 2007, that history was not included in the tours. And when I asked the tour guide why not, after my personal tour, he told me the subject was too controversial. So that's where my quest started. It was initially just to learn about enslaved people. And that started with me being directed to an inventory of enslaved persons who were sold with the plantation in 1854. And then I learned there was an inventory from 1865. And then people, as they learned I was interested in that history, the history of Black people at Clemson, I learned there were sharecroppers. There were formerly enslaved people who were working at Fort Hill during Reconstruction. And then someone said, oh, there were prisoners that the trustees leased to help to build Clemson. And then I learned that there were wage workers hired to work at the college and Black cooperative extension agents. And I had heard about Harvey Gantt, desegregating Clemson in 1963, but I hadn't heard about those students who came kind of in the first couple of decades who were the trailblazers following Harvey. And then finally, Generation 7, the students who are currently enrolled at Clemson, who are also very active on campus, very engaged on campus, and who wanted to be part of Call My Name. So, my question, what do we know about enslaved people, led me to learn that there have been generations of African Americans, of African and African American people in the university's history that were not part of that public narrative. And so Call My Name, in the simplest of terms, seeks to recover and share those stories, but also by calling those names out loud every day, we invite the public to help us stitch that history back together. So it is a kind of a community-oriented project, very, very dedicated to community engagement and valuing the voices and contributions of others who want to help us to record this history.
That is such an inspiring story, and you answered my other question, which was kind of, could you describe the moment or circumstance when you knew you had to do this? And it sounds like in that first fall when you were teaching, just being at the John C. Calhoun site, and that slavery was not a part of the conversation. Thank you for being the one to make sure it is now.
Mhm.
So thank you so much. And my other question is, what
Yeah.
obstacles have
And I
you—
think it really was that,
Oh, keep going. Sorry.
yeah, I was gonna say, I think it really, I mean, it was that moment, but it was really that inventory, the
Yes.
1854 inventory of seeing names, seeing those 50
Yes.
names.
Mhm.
That was like the no turning back moment where,
That's right.
right before I knew, yeah, I was gonna say, I knew I had to do it, but once I saw that we had names, then I knew that I had to continue.
How many enslaved people, at the height of the power of that family, would you say was the maximum number of enslaved people in any given year? Was it 50? Was it 100? Was it more?
It was over 100. We actually have just recovered inventories of enslaved people who were brought from Alabama to Fort Hill, and we're
Wow.
working through those documents to see if we can come up with a definitive list. At the end of the Civil War, there were over 100, so we know that there were at least 100 at any given time after that, after Andrew Pickens Calhoun purchases the plantation and brings enslaved people that he owned from Alabama. That's when that number more than doubles for the rest of the time that slavery existed in the United States.
Got it. And then, as you kind of started your quest, as you called, I love that word, you started your quest to really call these names and bring them to the forefront and bring this history to life. What obstacles have you faced in your research, and how have you um, how have you persevered through them?
I think one of the biggest obstacles is just finding information. When you look at inventories of enslaved people, their first names listed. So we have, over 100 first names. And so it was just figuring out how to trace people when you only have a first name. I
Right.
think the other obstacle is just resources early on. I didn't have a lot of financial resources until I
Sure.
met a Clemson alum by the name of Dr. James Bostic Jr. I was just starting to document the history of the convicted laborers, and he heard about my work and gave me a very generous donation and challenged my provost, Bob Jones, to match that donation. And so all
Wow.
of a sudden, I went from having no money to having over at the $100,000,
Yay.
to do the work. So I was able to hire students to help me and to travel and start networking with other professors at other universities that were doing the work. And that's when the project really took off because, I could get subscriptions to Ancestry and get
Sure.
access to databases, right? I could hire people to help me. I could travel to conferences and meet, the folks that were doing the work and learning the techniques that I needed. I'm an English professor who loves history, so I'll
Yes.
be the first to admit that I had some things to learn.
Mhm.
But very, very generous scholars and local historians and people that I met at conferences were eager to help. And so I just soaked it all up, and my project continued to grow once I had, the resources that I needed to really do the work.
Fantastic. And on the other side of that, and you kind of hinted at it just now, but what has surprised or encouraged you in your research so far?
I think that there's more than I ever expected to find, that the more we search, the more we find. When I learned about the prisoners, that the trustees had leased, back in the late 18 and early 1900s, the caveat was there are no records. They're
Wow.
like, okay, we've already looked, there are no records. And I thought, well, let me look
Let
myself.
me try.
Let me try and find them. So I'm sending letters all over the state of South Carolina,
Wow.
trying to find these records. And finally, one of our archivists said, why don't you try the state archive?
Sure.
So I sent them an email and they were like, yeah, we have records, we have registers, we have court records, we have, pardon records, we have parole records, we have security checks where we can tell you
Oh
when
my
people were taken to
goodness.
and from Clemson. And all of a sudden I went from, oh, there are about 50 to there are over 300 that we've documented
Oh
so
my
far.
goodness.
So I've learned to keep searching and to not
Yes.
take no for an answer. If people tell me it can't be found, to say, well, we're going to look.
Hmm.
We're finding that more and more records are being digitized and made available to the public. So, and it's just persistence and just turning over every stone, knocking on every door, picking up the phone
Hmm.
and calling people. So that's what keeps me going, is that the story keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Absolutely. And that's such a great lesson for us all that if someone says no, no, it's, you know, to persevere and continue to search. And I love that lesson. And clearly
Mm,
it's yielding incredibly interesting and new insights that we needed to see. So thank you for that.
mhm,
So now we're going to turn to some reader
absolutely.
questions. Thank you to all of our
Okay.
wonderful readers for submitting. Um, our first reader question is from David M. And this is an important distinction he asks us to kind of clarify here. Did the university as an entity enslave people? Since there is now a list of names and possible connections to today's descendants, is there an effort to offer scholarships or to any of these
Mm.
individuals who are connected? Also, is there any documentation on the list on the lives of the enslaved people on campus, housing, churches, etc.?
Mm. So the first thing I need to make a distinction is that the university was founded in 1889. So we were established on John C. Calhoun's Fort Hill Plantation by his son-in-law, Thomas Green Clemson, who is actually our founder. So Mr. Clemson left his estate to the state of South Carolina to create what he called a high seminary of learning. And so they decided to call that college the Clemson Agricultural College of South Carolina. So technically, right, we're on a plantation built post-Civil War. So the university would not have owned slaves. Enslaved people would not have purchased, would not have been involved, but many of our founders, and John C. Calhoun, of course, one of the most ardent pro-slavery politicians of the 19th
Yes.
century,
Mhm.
bought, sold, mortgaged, was very, very involved in the slave trade, as was our founder, who also owned enslaved people, worked as a manager of Fort Hill. So what we find is in the correspondence of the Calhouns and the Clemsons are mentions of enslaved people that they owned back during the antebellum period. So we have been able to learn about those, especially who worked in the house as domestics or valets. They were traveling with them, they were taking care of them and their children. And so there are numerous references to enslaved people who labored very, very closely to the Calhouns and the Clemsons. We have learned that during the antebellum period, they worshiped in the woods, that
Really?
we know a lot about the quarters that they lived in. There are really good descriptions of those quarters. The prisoners who built Clemson dismantled those quarters. They were made out of granite stones, and they are actually the foundation of the Hardin Hall building on our campus, the oldest academic building on campus. So we have that tiny little, but significant, right, tangible evidence of, enslaved people's lives still
Mm.
on our campus with us. So the most that we know has come from those letters, but we also have been able to find some descendants. There's a woman, her name is Eva Hester Martin. Her ancestors, Sharper and Caroline, were enslaved at Fort Hill, and their daughter, Matilda, was just a child when slavery ended, and she lived and had a daughter named Anna, and Anna was Miss Eva's mother. And so she would listen to stories that Mama Tildy, they called her, told about life as an enslaved person at Fort Hill. So we do also have access to a little bit of oral history that's been passed down in families that kind of fleshes out and provides a different perspective on slavery. And there is one letter of an enslaved person. Her name was Susan Calhoun Clemson Richardson, who worked for the Herlong family over in Augusta, Georgia.
Okay.
And one of the children in that family saved some memories that Mrs. Richardson had of being enslaved at Fort Hill. So those are some of the ways that we are able to document that history. We wish we had more, but often you will find for enslavers like the Calhouns or the Jeffersons or the Washingtons that it is in their family correspondence where you find lots of references to the enslaved people who labored for them.
Absolutely. And is it correct that I've seen images of descendants of the enslaved people from the Calhoun plantation come back for reunions on the property?
Yes, that happens occasionally. Yes, that has happened. We're actually hoping to have a reunion where we invite all of the descendants, who have identified or who we have identified to come back, not a particular family, but as many families as we can. I think the reader also asked about scholarships, and I will
Oh,
say
yes.
that we have some students who are interested in creating a scholarship fund for descendants.
Wow.
So they are working on that to see if that is possible
hmm
to identify those descendants and provide some scholarship assistance for
Yeah.
them.
Have you I've heard that there's research being done into the enslaved people that helped to build and labored at Georgetown University. Do you have any kind of
Mhm,
notes or
mhm.
comments on that whole kind of history as well in relation to kind of what you're working on?
Yeah, so I think with that particular project, they were able to um, have a lot more documentation than we do.
Got it.
So the enslaved people that were sold to raise money to,
Right.
to assist with the financial needs of Georgetown. My recollection is that many of them were sent down to the Delta in the New Orleans area. And so because they had names and they were affiliated with the Catholic Church, there were more extensive records that were kept. And so they've been able to identify, and a scholarship fund has been set up
Yeah.
for those descendants. And there have actually been descendants who have gone to Georgetown to
Mhm.
pursue their degrees. And they have a descendant community organization, and Georgetown has gone to great lengths to ensure that those descendants are identified and they're involved in the various programs and initiatives that are sponsored by the university. And I also had a chance to take part in a transcription program where we were
Oh,
looking through
wow.
the records and trying to find the names, of enslavers and enslaved people. And so I've seen the records, and I can say that they are much more extensive than we have for John C. Calhoun's Fort Hill Plantation.
Got it. Well, that is really encouraging to hear that the scholarships have been set up at Georgetown, that
Mhm.
it is possibly in the works and is in the works at Clemson. That's incredibly encouraging to hear.
Yeah, and I
All
would
right.
say discussions are happening. I'm not
Okay,
sure where the
discussions.
discussions are going to go.
Yes.
Yeah, but we're in the very earliest stages, and it is a student initiative, right? This came from
Sure.
our students to say that they wanted to provide that financial assistance to descendants.
Yeah, that's wonderful. All right, next from reader Randy B. Hello, Professor Thomas. Do you have any records of slaves who served in the Confederate Army from Clemson University? Thank you. And obviously this relates to the what we discussed before that
Mhm.
Clemson University was founded after. But anyway, how would you answer this one, Professor Thomas?
So the only reference that we have actually is from one of John C. Calhoun's grandsons who served in the Confederate Army. His name is Duff Green Calhoun. He is the son of Andrew Pickens Calhoun, John C. Calhoun's eldest son. So one of our researchers actually came across this reference in a letter, and he was talking about the possibility of taking an enslaved man with him to the front lines as a cook, because apparently that was pretty common practice in the regiment in which he served.
Wow.
We have not been able to document if that happened, but so far that is the only reference that we have found to any of the Calhouns who might have taken an enslaved person with them when they went to serve in the Confederate Army.
That almost reminds me a bit of in my research of Francis Marion, the swamp
Mm,
fox,
mhm,
how he had his kind of enslaved, you know, aide de camp, or he was his what would you call him? His not his I mean he was his enslaved partner almost.
mm. Sometimes they
And
call them the ballet or the body
valet, yeah,
servant.
that's the word. Thank you. Enslaved valet, who we have that painting where Oscar Marion is cooking the sweet potatoes. Do you know
Mm,
that the one that I'm talking about?
I don't. I have to look for that.
So it's this beautiful painting where there's, Francis Marion, and it's oddly enough, he's entertaining, like there's a British soldier in the painting, and the British soldier is like watching this scene unfold where Oscar Marion, his enslaved valet, is cooking sweet potatoes. And apparently the story goes that the British said, "Oh wow, if all they're eating is sweet potatoes and they're still doing so well against us, we all better be afraid of these, rebel patriots." Anyway,
Mm,
but
mm,
I'll have to share that the painting with you. But
mm,
this idea of bringing along your enslaved valet as
mhm,
your cook
mhm,
instantly made me think of
mhm,
that piece of South Carolina history
mhm,
as well.
mhm.
Um, so interesting. All right, next from reader Gabriel N. Professor Thomas, how easy or hard is it for someone who has grown up in this area, and as far as they know, parents were also born and raised in this area,
Mm.
to try and trace their lineage to their enslaved ancestors? And really, in your experience, what is the curiosity level of local people to find out?
So I would say my experience has been that they're very curious to to trace their ancestry. What we're finding is um, now that I'm more familiar with the names of people post-emancipation, um, a lot of times people don't know, right, that they're related because of marriage, right? One of
Mm,
the so you might have a very familiar family name and you have a daughter, and then the daughter gets married and she takes her husband's name. And sometimes that history gets lost because a few
sure.
generations later, the wife's name is no longer called, right? Great grandchildren or great great grandchildren, 2 or 3 generations later, and you have no idea that your ancestor, is a descendant of an enslaved person who labored at Fort Hill or one of the sharecroppers.
Right.
So what we are trying to do with Call My Name is actually circulate those names and reconnect those families,
Right.
or to say these are, the surnames of the sharecroppers. And what we started discovering is that a lot of those families settled in the local communities. We've gone to local cemeteries and we've seen the tombstones
Wow.
of the names, right, that we can connect back to a sharecropper contract or a name that's really unusual back to even enslaved people. We've been able to trace them.
Mm,
So we're sharing that information with the public to say, one of my grad research assistants will just call a name and he'll say, hey, if you're from the local area and you've heard this name in your family, you might be related. So for us, it's putting these names out into, the public sphere and asking people to talk to their families to see if
yes.
these are names that may have been passed down. But it's also like, if I know a name and I meet a person and I'm like, hey, that name sounds really familiar, I will also connect with them and say, hey, you might be connected to some of the families whose stories we're documenting.
And are there certain names that are particularly unique that you've called out to the community?
They're just names that are more familiar. One of the families that's very, very well known in the local community is the Brewster family and the Greenlee
Brewster.
family. And so, every time I see those names, I'm always wondering if they are connected. We reach out to people when we can and let them know about the work that we're doing. These are names that if you go to even Clemson's website now and look at some of the information that the university has provided about enslaved people whose stories have been documented, you'll see those surnames popping up, and those are, people are interested, if they go to the Fort Hill Plantation website on the university website, there are links that you can click on, and you can see some of those documents, and you can see some of the presentations that have been created about enslaved people and their descendants, and those names are there.
Fantastic. And when, going back to the John C. Calhoun era, did the enslaved people that worked on the plantation, did they adopt the Calhoun last name? How did that piece work?
We're still trying to parse that out. What we have found so far is that many of them did not,
Interesting.
that they adopted other names. They were known as the Calhoun, enslaved people, as a Calhoun enslaved person.
Mhm.
And people often assume that they took the name Calhoun, but we are not seeing that as a common practice where they, after emancipation, identified themselves as Calhouns. So there's not been a strong pattern to suggest that that was the standard practice. Actually, the very opposite, that they chose many different names after they were free.
Interesting. That's really interesting. Um, all right. So I also wanted to ask you, Dr. Thomas, if you can kind of describe um, kind of three of your top, I maybe call it your eureka moments or moments of discovery that kind of took your breath away or really surprised you in this process since you began. Would love to hear if there are like three like distinct moments you might have had
Mhm.
in the Call My Name project.
Yeah, I would say learning about Issy. Issy was an enslaved girl at Fort Hill, and around 1840 or so, she, for reasons that we don't know, decided to set a fire inside the Fort Hill Plantation house.
Oh, wow.
And she took a hot coal and put it on a feather pillow. And of course, a fire started. And, some people say it was accidental, some people say it was intentional, but a fire started and they sounded the alarm and were able to put the fire out. About a year earlier, her brother, Sonny, had started a fire in the overseer's tent
Oh,
and
wow.
burned him. And so it's interesting to me that these children were children of old Sonny, who had been the childhood companion of John C. Calhoun and was considered to be, the quote favorite. So the favorite's children set fires. One tried to burn up the overseer, one tried to burn down the house.
Wow.
And because of that kind of favorite status, the children had really committed arson, and the punishment for arson was the death penalty. But instead, they
Wow.
were sent off to a plantation owned by Andrew over in Alabama. We are still trying to find them, what happened to them.
Hmm.
But that was a story where I thought, what kind of environment were they in, that the children of the quote favorite
Favorite,
enslaved
right.
person, one tried to take out the overseer, right? And one tried to burn down the house. So it
Wow.
made me really think about, what kind of environment had the Calhouns created at Fort Hill
Mm,
for enslaved people, that those children who may have had, opportunities and an experience that was different from a field hand, or different from, a person who worked in a different capacity, if they, resisted in that way.
hmm.
That was a moment where I really, really kind of took a harder look at the Calhouns in Clemson to think about, their participation and their application of enslavement. I think another moment was finding the records of the prisoners that people told me didn't exist.
Right.
And recently, we went through they call them the security check records. And so it tells you when prisoners left the penitentiary and when they were released, or they died, or they were sent back. And there was this one prisoner from, I think it was about 1903 or 1904. And I saw when he was sent to Clemson, and then his name didn't appear again for years, for like 7 or 8 years when he was paroled. And I
Mm.
thought, did we miss, did we miss something? Like, did he really stay at Clemson that long? So I was able to
Wow.
go to the archive actually just last week, and I found his parole papers and learned that
No
he
way.
had been at Clemson that whole time until he was paroled. So he had been
Wow.
convicted of murder and got a life sentence,
Mm.
but he was able to have them relook at his trial. And what happened is he should have been convicted of involuntary manslaughter, which had a
Mm.
much less, you know, sentence. And because he had served more than he would have gotten if he had been convicted of manslaughter, what had happened, he got into a fight with a man who was trying to harm his family. And so
Mm.
he had, claimed self-defense, but he didn't have really good legal representation. And
Hmm.
so when the facts of the case came out and they realized that he had served more time than he would have if he had gotten that manslaughter conviction originally, he was paroled. But it was like, wow, they kept him there for years until that
Mm.
case got resolved. And that was just a moment in thinking about how, the prison system was impacting young Black men, at the
Yep.
turn of the century. I would say the third moment is just learning more about Harvey Gantt, who
Hmm.
desegregated Clemson. When I got to Clemson, it was described as integration with dignity. It was peaceful.
Mm.
There was that lawsuit, but it was just a matter of things had to work their way out, right? And
Hmm.
when I went to the archive and read the records, I learned that Harvey Gantt had a 2-year journey before he filed the lawsuit, and that there was a lot of resistance on the part of Clemson,
Mm.
even though Brown versus Board of Education, that Supreme Court decision had mandated the desegregation of public schools. South Carolina is the last state to desegregate its schools, and
Wow.
Clemson is the first public school, and they fought it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Wow.
So once again, I'm looking and saying, wow, that's kind of a moment. But Harvey Gantt didn't just file a lawsuit, but it was a class action lawsuit. He didn't want to
Hmm.
be the only Black student to come to Clemson. He wanted to open that door for any Black student to come.
Right.
And so I looked at him. He's this young man. He's an activist. He wants to go to school in his home state, and he puts everything on the line. And he changes Clemson for the better,
Hmm.
by winning that lawsuit and opening the doors for many students to come to Clemson.
Fantastic. Is there any sort of monument or memorial or plaque for him on campus?
So there are some monuments around Gant Circle, which is a little horseshoe street in front of Omain or Tillman Hall, that acknowledge, that historic moment in January of 1963. We also have a South Carolina historical marker
Right.
right there in front of Omain. And if you go inside the building, there's a little exhibit on the left side, and right outside the door of the room where he registered, there's a little display that talks about that historic moment. We're hoping to do more for him on the Black Heritage Trail that's being created, and put that, you know, marker that will be outside of Tillman Hall.
Got it. And then kind of as I'm zooming out and seeing these kind of eras that we're discussing, the era of enslavement on the Fort Hill plantation with John C. Calhoun and Thomas Green Clemson and that kind of era. The Civil War happens, and then Clemson is founded, and we have these convicted laborers working at Clemson. Um, is a portion of your research, I mean, you're talking about all different types of, research here. It's really interesting. You're digging into archives, you're talking to people, there's oral history, there's, going and, rummaging through these old files. But are you also participating in, are you also using archaeology in your research? Kind of looking at where the convicted
Mm,
laborers were working, what buildings did they help build? Can you kind of speak to that
mhm.
piece where like the kind of the fit, and you've already spoken about the, where the enslaved people worshipped in the woods and the granite foundation that's now the foundation of a building on campus. Can you speak to how archaeology kind of has woven itself into your research as well, and where the convicted laborers' efforts are now we can now see on campus today?
So there are 4 or 5 buildings. So there's Sykes Hall, Tillman Hall, Hardin Hall, and Trustee House are the 4 buildings that are still standing that convicted laborers built. Unfortunately, archaeology is kind of difficult around these buildings because, sidewalks have been put in and,
Right.
you know,
Sure.
a lot of the landscape has changed. But one of the interesting things I had the opportunity to do that's not archaeology, but it's more about preservation, is there's a renovation of Tillman Hall taking place right now. And so our campus preservation officer took us inside the building for a tour. And at some point, Clemson decided to kind of um, tuck in the ceiling, and they covered up these majestic. It was just, the ceiling was so high, beautiful beams with gold accents,
Wow.
stained glass windows in the chapel in this building. And
Hmm.
this was the handiwork of those prisoners. They had to cut those
Wow.
beams, they had to lift them up in this cathedral-like space. And so it's not archaeology, but it's, kind of peeling back the layers of the building and
Yes.
actually seeing the original work that was done. So
Mm.
all of that is being restored, and that room is being transformed into a lecture hall that's going to
Hmm.
open in a couple of years. And
Wow.
all of that will be visible. So when people come in there into that auditorium space, they'll be able to see this beautiful handiwork that was covered up for years. In the cemetery, there are we kind of have an idea of where they are buried, and
Mhm.
but we don't have markers to say this is the exact spot. We're looking at um, primary sources by Carol Cowan Ricks. She was an African American archaeologist that came to Clemson in 1990. She
Mm.
was here 3 years, and through her work, she was able to identify the area in the cemetery where it is believed that they are buried on the west side. So
Mm.
we're going to have interpretive markers in the cemetery that will be installed that will tell that story.
Wow.
But at this point, we've used GPR, to find the anomalies believed to be burials.
Mhm.
But we probably will never know, but you never can tell. But at this point, we have not been able to determine exactly where they're buried. We know their names. We know what they died of. We
Mhm.
have death dates.
Wow.
And we have an approximate area in the cemetery where we believe they're buried. But at this point, that's as far as we can go with archaeology. It's just identifying sites and
Mhm.
kind of seeing the interior work in those
Yeah.
historic buildings that were built by the prisoners.
That is so amazing to hear that we know for sure that those beautiful beams and that beautiful woodwork was done by those people. And as we look back into, you know, the history of those convicted laborers, the history of slavery, just the fact that these individuals were not able to read or write, and or many of them could not read and write, but what they've left behind is the literal foundations of our country in many cases. That is just so profound to me that although they might not have had the voices, their their physical labor and the beauty of it still remains. And I am very
Mhm,
hopeful that, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this too, that we're entering into an era of American history where we're delving into the history of slavery and enslaved people in a way like we've never had before, where we're bringing, just as you are, bringing voices to people who didn't have, we're calling their names, we're showcasing their handiwork and their physical, what they built, the
mhm,
foundations of our society. I find it incredibly just moving and so important. And Do you believe that is kind of happening in our society right now and in your research in the historical community that as we're delving in, just making sure that we're paying attention to these physical remains and physical things that these people made and the impact of those?
Yeah, I think that there are people in America who are interested, and around the world, who are interested in ensuring that, the work and the lives of the marginalized, the oppressed, those who have suffered in our country and in other
Mhm.
spaces. There are people who are dedicated to ensuring that our history is complete. It's complicated. Some of
Yes.
it's painful, but we cannot just focus on the parts of our history that make us feel good or look good.
Yes.
History is very messy,
Hmm.
no matter where you are in the world. No one has pristine history where they got
Right.
everything right.
Right.
So this history, the history and legacy of slavery, is one of those aspects of American history that I fully believe needs to be um, documented, needs to be shared, needs to be accessible. It's part of knowing what it means to be in America, to live in America, to be an
Yes.
American.
Yes.
Um, I do want to point out with the convicted laborers, one of the things that we're finding is those who were pardoned or paroled. One of that might be a fourth eureka moment is
Okay.
occasionally there's a letter that they wrote to the governor asking for a pardon or asking for parole and making their case. And I love to read those letters that are written in their own
Wow.
hand so you can hear their voice. We have more than a name, we have
Absolutely.
more than demographic information. We have an actual piece of evidence,
Mm.
created by the person whose
Yes.
story we're documenting. So that's another beautiful thing about delving into the archive is you never know what you're going to find.
Hmm.
And it's not, they got caught up in the system. Most of them are convicted of theft, of stealing food and clothes, or
Mm.
just living in really difficult times. But that voice comes out and it just gives you a little bit of insight
Mm.
into what it was like for them to try and negotiate that system and to plead their causes directly to a governor.
Hmm.
And often, they were able to get their sentence reduced, or they were able to get a pardon. Those that asked for them, not all of them did,
Wow.
but those that advocated on their own behalf. And so me, it's like, well, where did you get the pencil, and where did you get the
Yeah.
paper, and where did you get the stamp?
Right. Oh my
Somebody was
goodness.
helping them. So there's
Sure.
stories, right, that we're still documenting and we're still learning. And so I read every single piece of paper in a folder because you never know. You
You
never
never
know
know.
what little detail you're going to find. And when I find a voice, it's definitely an
Mm.
extraordinary moment.
Extraordinary. Absolutely. Um, and then kind of zooming out to today, and
Mhm.
obviously you've been speaking about these incredible projects to document further this history and put historical markers on campus. And um, zooming out even more than that, how do you think the Black experience at Clemson has shifted or changed since you started your research and made this really a university and community-wide project? And I'd also love to hear about your students that you work with. How many students are you working with at any given time for the Call My Name project and kind of the excitement around it? I'd love to hear your thoughts, how that has impacted the larger university.
I would say, I was in a class this morning and a student told me, I was asking them how they heard about Call My Name, and the student said, when I first got to Clemson, I heard about your project. And I was like, wow, I'm really glad to hear that. And then she said, but more students need to hear about your project. So, you know, students are finding out about Call My Name. They are discovering that, the university story. We have a plantation house sitting in the middle of our campus that belonged to John C. Calhoun. A lot of them were introduced to that house as a historic home. A lot of them don't know who John C. Calhoun is. I would have to say that they
Yeah.
don't understand. They know he's a politician,
Mhm.
but they don't know a whole lot about him. And so Call My Name has enabled students to, to learn more about the history of our land and the history of the plantation and the history of enslaved people and others, laborers until Harvey Gantt gets here and the musicians that came, right? It's like there's this history, this rich history. If you love Clemson, then you have to love all of Clemson. And this
Yes.
is a part of that narrative that you haven't had access to.
Mhm.
And so learn this history and then see what happens. And I tell them you will love Clemson more. So
Yeah.
I think what we've tried to do is say, learn the history and you will love Clemson more because you'll appreciate where we are.
Mhm.
Our numbers of African American students are about the same as when I got here.
Okay.
So but I would say the students who are coming, there are more student organizations that they can be a part of. There are, more opportunities on campus for programming, more support services that are offered to all students, but especially students of color that they can avail themselves of.
Mhm.
I think that Call My Name has helped to highlight the need for the university to incorporate this history into its public narrative.
Mhm.
I went from, a project with a social media site to now, all of these initiatives that we're doing to give people multiple ways into the project. You might come to one of my presentations, but now soon you're going to be able to watch videos. There's
Mhm.
an exhibit next fall. There's a trail on campus, right? There's going to be a music video that's created. There's a play, there's multiple ways in. And people ask me, why are you doing this? And I said, no excuses. I want
No
people to
excuses.
have a path into the history, right? And then once you're in, I believe you're gonna go read the book, or you're gonna want to read some of the primary documents, or you're gonna want to learn more. And you're going to want to ask the university to make sure that this information is accessible to everybody publicly.
Yes. Yes.
So, that's kind of where we're going. I have how many students working for me now? I think I have 4 students working for me now,
Great.
2 graduate
Fantastic.
students and 2 undergraduate students.
Hmm.
They are working on different projects. One works with my social media
Mhm.
site and creating programming for students. Another student is my creative media assistant. She creates all the flyers and she works on a blog that we are going to be publishing on my website. I
Awesome.
have another student who is kind of helping with the video project. I just hired
Okay.
her. Another student will be helping with the documentation of Clemson football.
Oh,
So
okay.
sometimes they're just an assistant who helps with whatever I need, and then other times they
Yes.
work on specific projects.
Well, I have to tell you, Professor Thomas, that your online presence is really impressive. And I'm somebody that works in marketing, and I have just been really impressed. So please tell your team, and bravo to you. That it's just very well laid out, very well done.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yes.
Well, I have to give
And
a shout out to Cedar Wolf Media out of Charleston. They designed the website and they know that I love beautiful things. So I'm
yeah,
really happy that they were able to create a site that's beautiful, but also, really accessible and easy to navigate.
absolutely. I can attest to that. And speaking of all the various media you're using to bring these stories to life, I am so fascinated by the play you were writing. Can you tell us a
Mhm.
bit more about this play? And I'm a theater person, a Broadway person. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, maybe the play will be on Broadway someday. Can you tell us a bit about that project?
Well, yeah, we hope so. So I'm collaborating with Tectonic Theater Project out of New York City. They are a professional theater company. They are well known for the Laramie Project, a play that was about a young man, a gay young man who was violently murdered. And they went to the town and interviewed people and then wrote a play about the various perspectives of that horrific incident. And so, because they are community engaged theater, is the way I describe it.
Mhm.
Um, it's a collaborative process where you are taking the words of people who were involved in the history that you are trying to document, and it is kind of crafted into a narrative through moment work. So you kind of reduce things down to a moment. Like, let's look at a moment. Let's not look at a scene. That was really hard for me because I was And I tell them I'm in the
Yes.
19th century. We think in sentences, like long paragraph, long sentences.
Sure.
So,
I know what you
right.
mean.
So like drilling down to a moment, but then you string those moments together and you make scenes, and they're really, really powerful. So we've been digging in the archive. I've been working with a group of actors in the theater lab to bring these stories to life. So we are looking at the story of Issy, who started the fire.
Fires,
One of the
right?
convicted laborers, Wade Foster, the 13-year-old, he was the first teenager that I saw on the list of convicted laborers. Harvey Gantt, of course. We're also looking at Cato Sherman. He was one of the sharecroppers. His daughter, Lula, was raped by a white man in central South Carolina, and she died of her
Wow.
injuries. And then
Mm.
her father and some men got together and lynched her assailant. And it was a national story. And
Wow.
eventually, all of the men were let off. And it was an extraordinary moment in South Carolina history when people said that men have you know, have kind of this, if they stand up to protect their family, especially women and their family, then that is a special consideration that should, be offered. If we're going to offer it to white men, we ought to offer it to Black men as well.
Mm. Wow.
And so that story, also the story of Duke Ellington coming to Clemson in
Oh, yeah.
1955 to
Mhm.
perform, and the story of Tom Littlejohn. He was one of the wage workers. He was a chef in the
Oh,
mess
okay.
hall for many, many years. And his son, Horace, opened the Little John's Grill. It was a kind of a club, restaurant, hotel in the city of Clemson for Black entertainers back in the day.
Wow. That's fantastic. And do you think will the play be first shown at Clemson itself, or do you think it will premiere?
Yes, we
Yeah.
actually had a reading for the first half of the play a couple years ago when we were celebrating the 60th anniversary of desegregation. So that was Issy Wade's and Harvey Gantt's story
Oh,
that
okay.
were read by a professional group of actors. So I was in New York this summer and we were working on part two, and we had kind of a in-house reading of what we had accomplished in that week I spent with them.
Mm.
So the goal is to start at Clemson, to go to Broadway, to tour nationally, but we're also talking about the possibility of taking what we've done to other universities who have similar histories and teaching them our methodology and helping them
Hmm.
to create plays about their history as well.
Oh, I can't wait for for the the idea of seeing this on Broadway. I'm such a huge fan of theater
Mhm.
and how that brings us all together in such a an important and emotional way in person. So I'm so excited for you. That's fantastic. All right, so now we're going to move on
Mhm.
to our rapid fire Carolina questionnaire that I like to do with all of my guests. And I'll start with question number one, which is, which historical figure, Professor Thomas, from South Carolina history, would you most like to have dinner with
Mhm.
and why?
That was a hard question because there are lots of people I would love to
Yes,
have
there are
dinner with.
many, many.
Yeah, many, but I landed on Robert Smalls.
What an amazing man.
I have
Yeah.
a lot of admiration for him, and I would just want to know everything. What was it like to grow up enslaved? He gets married, he's able to purchase the freedom of his family and then commandeer that ship and take a whole boatload of people to freedom. And he fights in the Civil War and he has this illustrious career afterwards. I would sit with him for days just listening to his life stories. And then he goes home and takes care of his mistress, his former, and I'm like,
It's incredible.
wow.
Yeah.
It's
Didn't
just an
he
incredible
purchase
story.
the house where
The
he had
house
been
where he had
formerly
been in,
enslaved?
yeah, where he had been enslaved. Yeah, I've been to the
And
house and seen it. It's just an amazing story. So yeah, Robert Smalls.
fantastic. And then what is the most surprising thing you've learned about South Carolina history?
I think the outsized influence South Carolina has had on American history. I didn't know that. And I've said it in public space, and people always ask me to say it again. And I say South Carolina is the epicenter of American history. And I believe that. I do. I know there's some folks up in New England that think they are,
I
and I was like,
I
no,
believe
it's South Carolina.
I completely agree with you. And I'm from New England, but I have family ancestry in South Carolina, and I would come down here as a young teenager and whatnot. And yeah, like a New Englanders, oh, it's all about the Boston Tea Party
Yes,
and this and that and this and that.
yes.
I'm telling you, but now, as I've delved into history of South Carolina, I completely agree with you. And now there are billboards up on the highway on 85 from the SC 250 committee that say
Mhm.
the revolution was won in South
In South
Carolina.
Carolina.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, hello.
Yes,
Um,
I agree.
yeah.
I did not know that. I didn't know a whole lot about my state before I started this project, and I've learned so much about South Carolina, and I am utterly convinced that South Carolina is the epicenter of American history.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. You and I could have a whole other podcast just on what you
We
just said.
could.
We literally could have another 5 hours on that. Okay, what is your favorite South Carolina history book or movie?
I would say Glory, about the 54th Regiment from Massachusetts.
Yeah.
I love that film. I love that story. It's so inspiring, and just moving. Just people who were like laying it all down for the
Yes.
cause. Just an amazing story. Yeah.
And then your favorite South Carolina food or dish?
Rice, rice,
Hmm.
more rice, please,
Yes.
rice.
Now, do you get the Carolina Gold rice? Like you
I've
get
had
really,
that. Yeah,
Mhm.
I have.
Yeah, I
But
specific,
I'm just rice.
I
I
love rice
grew
so
up
much.
eating rice. I mean, and as I learned the history of rice, it was a little harder for me, but I just still we ate it every day almost of my childhood. There's even if you come to my house now, there's usually a pot of rice sitting in the refrigerator.
Oh,
Um,
that's
if I
awesome.
need a quick meal, it's rice and
It's
something.
rice.
Mhm.
My husband and I, for our anniversary this year, we went down to Charleston and specifically, hit a number of historical sites
Mhm.
there. And one of the things that I wanted to do was find a restaurant that served Carolina Gold rice because I
Mm,
had read
mhm,
all the accounts of, the people who are trying to bring this back, the
mhm,
history of it,
mhm,
obviously with slavery and how good it tastes. Like
mm.
the descriptions of people eating it, they were like, okay, Japanese rice, take Japanese rice, but multiply that in deliciousness by 10. And I was like, oh, I have to eat this. So I did find a restaurant and I did have it, and it was
Mm,
absolutely divine. And so then after that, I bought it from the company that now
that's
froze it.
awesome.
And
Mhm.
yeah, I had to buy it. All right, favorite South Carolina festival or event?
You know, I would say I have not been to this event, but I want to go, and it's Spoleto down in Charleston.
Me too.
Um, is from everything that I read, it's like the thing that I want to do. But I've also been enjoying the new Juneteenth festivals in South
Mhm.
Carolina that are
Yes,
popping up now that Juneteenth has become a national holiday. It's been really interesting to see Juneteenth celebrated in South Carolina.
absolutely.
No, its origins are in Texas, but I think the spirit of what happened in Texas for part of our celebration here at Clemson. We um, we created a family tree for the enslaved who were emancipated at the end of the Civil War, and had their
Wow.
names that we put on a fig tree right next to Fort Hill. And
Oh,
I saw pictures. I mean, I took part, but then when I saw pictures of it, it was really, really moving. It was very simple. We just read their names and then, created this family tree for them where, they're visible, they're here.
they're here.
It was really, really moving. So for me, like South Carolina, having been, so involved with the practice and business of slavery, for us now to really find ways to grapple with that history and to honor the lives of those who were subjected to enslavement is something that I am particularly interested in and moved by and engage with myself in ensuring that especially young people have an opportunity to learn that history.
Absolutely. And then what is a must visit place in South Carolina for people who love history?
Mm. Charleston is the place to go.
Yes, I can
You've
attest to
got to go there.
that.
But I would also say Beaufort, South Carolina
Yes.
is
Mhm.
another place that I would highly recommend. Um, those two places. And in the upstate area, I would say Greenville, surprisingly. I mean, Greenville is kind of the up and coming,
That's where I live.
hot city in South Carolina right now, but it also has a lot of interesting history.
Yes.
So if
Is
you
Buf
want to know the upstate story, Greenville's a good place to start.
Absolutely. And is Beaufort where we would find more history about Robert Smalls? Correct me if I'm wrong, but is that where he was
Yep.
primarily based?
Yes.
Okay.
He's buried there. The house is there. The church that he attended is there. There's a good bit of information about him there.
Yeah, I have to plan a trip there. That's on my list.
And it's
Love
very
it.
beautiful in Beaufort. Yes,
Oh, it
so
does
it's a
sound
lovely
beautiful.
town.
Oh, and it sounds like the food is beautiful. Food is delicious and beautiful and
Yeah,
everything's beautiful.
food is
Love it.
beautiful throughout South Carolina.
That's absolutely true. Awesome. Well, we're going to wrap up our interview, and I always want to ask my guests, you are doing so many wonderful projects. How can we, in the, our readership of the newsletter, our
Mhm.
friends of the newsletter, how can we support the great work that you and your team is doing?
So, thank you for that. I would say, first and foremost, please follow us if you are
Okay.
on social media, Instagram or Facebook in particular, to follow our web pages. We post stories every day. That's also the place where you can learn about the different initiatives that Call My Name is involved in. I would say, look for programs. If we're having programs, please come out and support the educational programs. We're having a 5K. It's our third annual 5K next
Wow.
spring. It looks like it's going to be on March 9th.
Okay.
So the route takes you past sites of historic significance to Black history on campus.
Oh,
So
I wanna do that. We love
yeah,
my husband loves to run, and I sometimes join
please.
him for we
Yeah.
should come. It's so fun.
Well, you can run
Oh,
or walk,
I could run.
but
Yeah, I'm more of like a
I
run
was
walk
gonna
person.
say, yeah, it's run or walk, but we're growing. We're in our third year. And so that's a way, and again, we're just trying to find multiple ways to get people
Mhm.
into the project. If people want to make a financial donation, there's a link on the callmyname.org website.
Mhm.
We also, welcome donations. If people are interested in helping do research, I have tailor-made, small research projects that I'll give to folks. If you have access to ancestry.com, we have hundreds of names, many, many stories that we're trying to document.
Mhm.
So if we have history buffs or, people are interested in genealogy, I would welcome the opportunity to pull them in to the work of Call My Name and have them help us to document some of these stories.
Fantastic. Well, Professor Thomas, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for coming on our podcast today, for telling your story, for telling the stories of all of these incredible people who were part of Clemson's history, and now we are calling their names, which is the namesake of your project, and all the various ways that you are making this information available. It's incredibly inspiring, incredibly creative, incredibly important. So thank you again
Mhm.
for joining us, and we are excited to stay in touch with you in the future.
Thank you so much, Kate. It's been a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation and the support of the work.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to put pause on the recording and we can keep talking in a second. Hold on one sec.